Our next panel is going to be led by Janina Slawski. I've had the privilege of working with her at a big red bank and then a big green dinosaur of a company after 2011, and then now back at Alexander Forbes, I get the opportunity to work with probably one of the foremost minds when it comes to investment consulting, and prescribed assets is something that she's been quite passionate about, and in the media she's been involved in certain commentary around that. So Janina Slawski is going to lead a panel which will include Elias is going to join us, Sister Mabatho, I can't pronounce her last name very well, but Seeiso? Yay, it's not Seeiso, but yes. Sister Mabatho, Elias will join us, and the smartest economist on the planet, Isaah Mhlanga, will join us through for the panel discussion. A big hand, thank you.
So essentially, you've heard a lot so far today about prescription, and obviously that's one of the main themes that we're going to cover in this panel, but also about sustainable investing and the challenges of actually getting into it, and if you are an investor, and some of the challenges that consultants face. And then also now about climate change, and that is something I want to explore later in terms of opportunities for impact investing. But essentially, if you look at the Alexander Forbes stance on prescription, essentially let me quote it to you because it's something that we are incredibly passionate about, and we believe that we need to be an advocate on behalf of particularly the members of the retirement funds that we represent. So we are opposed to any regulation, including prescription, which could lead to suboptimal investment outcomes for investors, particularly members of retirement funds, where fiduciary duty requires that members' benefits be safeguarded and grown. So that is something that we're incredibly passionate about, and yes, we have been taking the message out as strongly as we can. A lot of our clients have been asking, what is Alexander Forbes doing and what can be done? And obviously we will lend our voice to any industry efforts, particularly through Isaah, but we do believe that we do need to respond directly, and obviously any opportunity to respond on this issue formally, we will also take on behalf of our clients. So we do see it as important in terms of our advocacy role. So I'd like to start the session on a rather negative note, which I don't like to do in terms of prescription, and then we'll end on the fantastic, great, and this is how we can prevent prescription and do everything that we've spoken about today in terms of impact investing. But I thought we needed to start off just by understanding the context in which prescription would be raised. I think if anyone sat down and actually thought about prescription and what it means, no one would logically say, yes, this is a great thing, let's go do it. There has to be a crisis that has arisen that's led to this being back on the discussion table. So maybe, Isaah, if I can start with you, just in terms of the ANC election manifesto obviously referred to investigating the introduction of prescribed assets to mobilize funds for financial institutions for socially productive assets. But just to talk about the macroeconomic, the fiscal situation in which we find ourselves, is it really that bad that people are desperately looking for dreadful policies like prescription? Just give us a sense of why people are so desperate.
Thanks, Janina. I think the macro environment locally is something that we would have reading about in the papers for quite some time. A bit depressing if you have to really distill on the details. Historically, South Africa has benefited a lot from improving global economic growth. You can take 1991, you can take 1998 after the Asian financial crisis, 2001 after the dot-com bubble, and 2007, 2008. South Africa's growth has always kick-started on the back of improving economic growth. Come 2008, global growth improves. South Africa economic growth only improved but marginally up to about 2013, 2015. Thereafter, a long, protracted slowdown in economic growth despite the still strong growth globally, which means we have desynchronized or decoupled from global growth. If you look at the local consumer, it's quite constrained. The highest unemployment rate currently that we have ever recorded since the quarterly labor force survey has been started in 2008. which means the consumer cannot be the lever that we can pull in order to improve economic growth. In terms of our fiscal matrices, debt to GDP ratio continues to increase, 60% this year as the 2019 budget. But if you add all the SOE bailouts, that can go to 65% or even above that, which means there's a need to consolidate, which means government cannot also be the lever that we can pull, which leaves one more sector in the economy that can be that lever that we can push, the private sector. If we look at the behavior of private sector investments over the past decade or so, it has tended to invest outside of the country rather than inside the country, which means there is a risk aversion to how investments have been undertaken. So as a result, we did not get the economic growth uplift that we could have from the private sector. So with over 6 trillion funds under management within the pension fund industry, or even more if we take the financial services sector broadly, there is a sense that the private sector can be forced to invest. We can also take the points that were mentioned earlier on, that there was a 5% commitment by the private sector to invest in developmental assets, which did not happen, despite some concerted effort to set the macroeconomic framework in the right direction, which by and large, we do have a good macroeconomic framework as a country compared to many other emerging markets. So there is a sense that we can force the private sector to invest, hence the discussion of prescription, to say if the private sector is not playing ball, despite some concerted effort to set the macro environment, the regulatory structure conducive, then we have to prescribe them how to invest. But unfortunately, if we look at many countries that have grown, it has not been through prescription, it has been private sector led. Of course, outside of China, which has been led by the state, many countries that grow have been driven by the private sector. So that's where the discussion of prescription comes from, which requires the private sector to engage and to actually try and lead the discussion in terms of what are the alternatives to prevent the negative consequences.
Maybe just help if any of you want to chip in here. Has there been any discussion of the detail? I guess we're all leaping into it's probably going to be Eskom debt. Is there any detail? I mean, again, there's been a lot of voice from the pension funds, but what about insurance companies? What about unit trusts? Is there any concept that it could be much broader than pension funds? And also just help with the arithmetic. So there's 450 billion debt at Eskom, you've got 6 trillion in assets, you take that across, you've still got 450 billion in debt. So I'm not really understanding how prescription is going to help us solve our debt problem. Anyone who wants to chip in here?
So far, there are no details on the type of assets that will be eligible for prescribed investments. This is just an idea that has been floated to say, let's try and harness the large amounts of capital that is available for developmental purposes. But if we just look at the last 10 years alone, where are the pressures? SOE funding, Eskom being one of them. So it makes sense, sitting from outside the discussions about prescription, to think that SOEs are some of the assets that will be called developmental. So you wouldn't really, I guess private sector participants or anybody will be forgiven for thinking Eskom is a developmental asset that will benefit from such prescription. So by and large, it's likely that SOEs are going to be a big majority, but if you think about developmental assets, they're much more wider, perhaps even much more bigger than the SOEs that we have.
And I think also, when we originally sort of raised our voice in terms of this issue, we spoke about the bad, which is traditionally where people think of prescription, which is going to force investment into bonds as previously applied. And we talked about the not so bad, where maybe there is forced investment, but maybe private sector, everyone gets to be involved in the discussion. And then the truly great, which is obviously where we've tried to take the conversation today in terms of let's facilitate real impact investing and overtake this need for the discussion around prescription. Is there any formal discussion of the middle ground? Maybe similar to what the UK has set up in terms of the PIP with infrastructure investments. Yes, there is a force, but there is also a oversight in terms of governance, etc. Any conversations along those lines, or is it really still on the basis that we're all just terrified it's going to be SOE bonds and at poor returns, and that's how they're going to solve their debt?
Well, I think the economists would know more about the discussions that are taking place, but I think as a private sector, we are suspicious of government. So it is an assumption that the allocation will go into parastatal bonds, because we understand that's where the need is. We haven't had any details as a private sector. It's unfortunate that the discussion is taking place now, because I think from a timing point of view, there is an awakening from masses of capital, and I'm talking predominantly on the pension fund side, of the importance and the need for impact investing. So the timing is off. Prescription and impact investing are supposed to address the same things. A number of changes have happened. In the pension fund industry, we've stopped talking about, oh, should we do impact investing? We're talking about how can we do impact investing? And we're also beginning to listen to what our members have to say. And they're saying to us, yes, we understand as fiduciary on pension funds. Yours is to make sure that I have a meaningful retirement. But the definition of what meaningful means to me is different from how you've understood it. So it's not just about managing risk return, but it's about impact. In other words, when I retire, I want to make sure I retire in a community where my children have a future because there are jobs, where there are services that are close that I can use. So the definition of investment has definitely widened. So the timing is really off. We are at the right time, and I do believe that we are in a position where we can do the right things as pension funds, simply because of a number of changes. One of the things that you spoke about earlier, and I know Elias was very hard on you, on us as consultants.
Not me personally.
I'm glad you didn't take it personally, Janina. But one of the stumbling blocks, because members have been saying, we want to invest in education, we want to invest in housing, we want to invest in infrastructure. They've been saying a lot of these things. One of the biggest challenges has been the advisors coming on board in terms of how do you have consultants that can facilitate those sort of investments and bring investable opportunities to the table. But again, I'm very optimistic because I've seen a big change. I mean, you speak about David Moore, who's just joined Alexander Forbes. He's been in the industry for a long time doing impact investing elsewhere. And I'm increasingly beginning to see many asset consulting homes scaling up in this area. So you are seeing a shift, I think, that is moving in the right direction. 2 days ago, I was at a forum of pension funds, and we're talking about how do we collaborate. Another way, there's pooling of assets. So you're talking about small investors, how can they get involved? Pooling, aside from funds of funds, pooling of assets. They're talking about collaboration. And there are examples internationally. In the UK, there are funds that have gotten together to form a fund that is impact investing. In Kenya, I think the top 14 pension funds have a consortium that is going to be doing impact investing and infrastructure investment. So I think the timing is off, but I think the need is critical and the timing is now. We need to be doing something now.
But maybe just, you immediately went into the positive, which we all like to do. I mean, there's a lot of different conversations happening. I mean, I heard the comment that why don't we invest into the SOEs, reserve jobs, just like the PIC has invested into EDCO. You know, how do we challenge that sort of thinking? And similarly, looking at the previous realm of prescription, where we're looking at and saying investment returns on prescribed assets were lower even than inflation, but certainly lower than alternative investments like equity, so it must have been bad. And thinking that today, in those days it was mainly defined benefit funds, so it was the employer and maybe the pension increases that were affected, whereas today it's mainly defined contribution, so it's members' monies that's affected. But there were some good. So where did we get the big, powerful Sasols and Transnets and so on from? It is from that era. So isn't there a conversation that needs to be had on a sort of holistic basis that says, we understand the imperative and we understand the positives, but how do you manage it? And maybe, as I said, there's not necessarily all in the perfectly great space. Maybe there's some middle ground where we have solid conversations that say, let's look at a way of setting up something that meets government imperatives in a more defined way and potentially comes with some of the positives while managing the negatives. Any ways we can get this conversation?
I'll be honest with you. The problem with when you're talking about prescription, and maybe I guess when you consult and engage, maybe you can structure something different. So you have certain commitments from government, because the concern is that you're driven into making investments where governance is bad. Whereas when you know that you are going to attract investment on the basis that the fundamentals are in place, it's a different thing. Prescription brings to mind that I'm going to be forced to invest even when the fundamentals are not there. When governance is bad, when there is no incentive to do the right things to attract investment. So I don't know what that conversation looks like. Is it a conversation where we ask government to have certain commitments? In other words, to say, before we can think of investing in ESCOM debt, for example, these are the conditions and they must agree to those conditions before we do that. I don't know. But those conversations are necessary. None of us are interested in investing in anything that's suboptimal. Anyone who's in the pension funds industry knows right now we are struggling to generate the sort of returns to meet our obligations and responsibilities to our members. So we're not keen at all.
Anything you want to add, Elias or Isaah?
Perhaps to address the issue of saying let's fund ESCOM from prescribed assets in order to save jobs, in the same line as EDCON was saved. Yes, EDCON was saved, private sector and government together saved a lot of jobs. But the idea that funding an unsustainable entity continuously will save 47,000 jobs at the expense of the millions of people that remain outside of the labor market itself is very misplaced. Because of the fiscal risk that continues to exist, merely because ESCOM takes a lot of state-owned funds in guaranteeing the debt, by itself is not solvent, which means, yes, we can save it today, and if nothing is done in order to change its operational model, we will continue to fund ESCOM from the fiscus. So it's a permanent cost to the taxpayer. Perhaps rather find short-term solutions to cushion those that will be impacted by restructuring of ESCOM so that they can, over time, transition perhaps to the renewable energy sector. That is a short-term cost that we'll be willing to take as a nation to say, but as it stands, it cannot be sustainable. We need to transition. What is the short-term cost that we can take? So that we have an energy sector that can sustain industrialization, which can create a lot more jobs for the people that require them.
Anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, two things. One is a little depressing, the other is a bit comforting. The depressing one is, unfortunately, there are state-owned enterprises that are too large to fail. If you can imagine a South Africa without ESCOM tomorrow, there'll be no economy. Somebody needs to take the risk, somebody needs to roll up their sleeves, somebody needs to turn around ESCOM. It has become very clear that government is struggling to do it on its own. That means the private sector needs to be involved. When you buy those ESCOM bonds, demand a board seat and go and change the organization from within. Don't try and change it from outside, it will not change. So if you are serious in being business, both in the short term and in the long term, if you allow ESCOM to fail, what you're trying to protect will not be there. So that's the depressing part. So we, as a country, we need to prioritize those that we need to throw as much resources towards to preserve, and those that we can do without. Transnet is another one. It's a very important asset, very important network, but it's been run inefficiently for a very long time. If you want to be a competitive economy globally, you need the efficiency of your rails and harbors. If you don't have that, you'll never be competitive. The positive side is that at least we're converging. And I think the prescribed assets debate is forcing us to engage. I'm going to use an analogy of an economy and marriage, for those who are married. The thing that binds a marriage is love. Some people say there's money as well. But I'm trying to keep it as a simple formula. You remove love, the marriage collapses. The thing that binds an economy together is confidence. You remove confidence, an economy crumbles. Now, the last time I looked at our confidence graph, 1994 to 2019. In 2019, we're exactly the same level of confidence we were in 1994. That means the potential for this economy crumbling are escalating. We have a responsibility to turn that around. So in a marriage, the party that realizes that I value this marriage a lot and want to keep it alive, at midnight they wake up and they wake you up and they say, let's talk. When they say that, it doesn't mean they're being aggressive. They want to protect this thing. So if we stand up and go to government and say, let's talk, government will listen because they also realize that they no longer have solutions. They've run out of solutions. Now, part of the problem that we're faced with is, all along, the concern was we have an inefficient public service. We have lack of trust. Today, there's an added problem. There's a leadership problem. And where there's a leadership problem, the likelihood of turning anything around is very limited. And that means we need to look at the private sector for this leadership. And we need people to raise their hands from this floor and say, we are going to be part of the party that is going to engage with government and assist it to turn the economy around. Those are my 2 comments.
That's the right conversation. And I think both of you alluded to it in terms of business case, investment case. I think that's what we're all seeking for as investors. So if it can be convincing, if we've got confidence in the governance, etc., investors will look to it. But that's the key difference with investing into an SOE debt versus investing into EdCon, where there was a massive focus on let's develop something that's investable. The other topic I wanted to cover off is that there's been quite a lot of conversation amidst the prescription that surely prescription is not as bad as an IMF bailout. So again, as I'll ask you to lead, so what is the risk of an IMF bailout? What would it entail? And what would the government do long before an IMF bailout in terms of what it would actually do to make changes that it has to do within the economy?
I think if you look at how the IMF addresses economic challenges, it's almost prescription in another form. Many countries that have run to the IMF and the medicine that have been administered has always been, you need to cut government spending, and largely it's the social spending. And given South Africa's current environment, we cannot afford to cut social spending. What is the likelihood of going to the IMF? Very unlikely, for a country to go to the IMF, they have to have about 3 things, or one of them, or in combination. It's a balance of payments crisis, which means they cannot afford to pay for imports, or they cannot afford to service foreign debt, or to pay foreign debt when it's due. It's a funding problem, which means they cannot raise funding from normal capital markets. And if you look at South Africa currently, we don't have a funding problem. We don't have a balance of payment crisis. I think even when you go back to 1994, the ruling party took a decision to say we will never, or we don't have the appetite to go to the IMF because they will prescribe to us how we solve our social challenges. The third aspect that you would need to have to go to the IMF is a banking sector crisis, which we do not have. The local banking sector is less exposed from a debt point of view. They are not borrowing from outside. We have been conservative, in part because the financial regulation that exists, we have adopted all the Basel Accords far ahead of many advanced economies. And as a result, we are one of the countries that have a very stable banking sector, which is not susceptible to external shocks. So from that point of view, we don't have any of the 3 prerequisites that normally leads to an IMF bailout. But differently, perhaps because of the lack of or slow progress to do the right things that seems to be difficult to do now, perhaps we do need an IMF bailout because it will force us to converge to where we agree to take the right solutions and actually implement. But that in itself is not saying that we are or we need an IMF bailout. We don't, and we are far from it.
Well, talking about investment cases, it's very traditional. If your balance sheet isn't looking so good, increase your income, decrease your expenses. The IMF will say that, Moody's is saying it, everyone knows that's what's got to happen. But I think it's an important message, because almost like it's imminent, so let's just do prescription instead, which doesn't solve any problems, because no income gets increased and no expenses get cut. But it is the fiscal discipline, the fact that we've got to cut back on expenses, tough decisions in terms of jobs at certain entities. So for me, we're already starting to see that from the government. We know that that's got to come, and that for me is the positive that actually says that's the road they're going to take, not the IMF, and not, we hope, prescription. I think maybe let's move on then away from the more sort of macroeconomic, broader, to what we started earlier as the conversation about why are we not getting investments into impact investing. And I did paint the picture earlier today, which I think fundamentally a lot of people don't understand, international investors as well as local regulators, investors, on just how different the South African retirement fund industry is in terms of being very defined contribution driven. And that for us is actually the big concern with prescription, is that it's members' money that gets affected, not some theoretical employer, maybe some future pension benefit, but actual members who are building up money towards the retirement. And that for us is the excuse that we hear. And Mabatho, I'm looking at you because I know you're quite passionate and you have implemented these on funds despite these difficulties. So we hear it's difficult in a defined contribution environment. You have to have liquidity, you have to have daily unit pricing, you have to have some concept that you can get out assets out, particularly if there's big changes in workforces. But just tell us about why you have seen it possible to still do impact investing in those environments, and what are the ways that funds have found to be successful despite the difficulties in terms of legislative or regulatory environment.
Yeah, I think maybe as a starting point, Janina, I think it's fair to say that in a DC environment, it is the member that takes a risk, and you want to make sure you do the right things for members. There was a lot of discussion and conversations around the fact that because we have predominantly DC funds in South Africa, then you can't do unlisted investments. That's not true. There isn't, the vast majority of fund, unless there's going to be, I don't know, a complete shutdown of an organization and you need 100% liquidity. Generally, you don't need your fund to be 100% liquid. You don't. So understanding your membership, understanding your liquidity requirements, you can still allocate to unlisted. The vast majority are not even allocating 2%, generally, but you can. And I do have an example of a fund that has done that. But I think it's been a misconception that you can't because it's a DC fund. That's not true. There are many DC funds that are doing impact investing or alternatives. How people go around the fact that you have to do daily unit pricing is that, you know, the illiquid part of your investments, whatever valuation is in that, is part and parcel of your daily unit pricing. So you take whatever price that there is at that point in time. There is a fund, it's a small fund, relatively, it's a 9 billion fund, that took a decision to do something that is specific for its membership. And I say this because a lot of the conversation has been around how do we change mindset so that we can do these things. And I think there is a misnomer that you cannot be innovative and be a good fiduciary. So to be a good fiduciary, you can't be innovative. It's better to stick to the middle and be a risk manager, yeah. And I think that's one of the things that gets in the way of doing some of these alternatives. People have been comfortable doing exactly what everybody else does, because if something goes wrong, then we're all in the same boat, and then the regulator's not going to come after us. And I think trustees are always concerned about the regulator coming after them directly. It's a big thing. Don't underestimate it. But this particular fund, it was at the time called the Road Freight and Logistic Provident Fund. Its membership were truck drivers. The average investment horizon of the membership was 5 years. So you're talking about pensions and it's supposed to be long term, but the reality is the investment horizon of the average member was around about 5 years. And then we began to look at the data of the claims that were coming in the fund. There were a lot of deaths that were happening, either through road accidents or a lot of deaths that were happening through things like HIV/AIDS. And the question was, what can we do for a membership that has meaningful impact for them now? And they came up with the concept of doing a truck stop in South Africa, but a slightly different from what you understand as a truck stop. And I think there are many people who've heard me speak about this, but I think for me, the excitement was a fund that took responsibility to do something differently. I must say, when we first thought about it, I broke out in a sweat, because I was thinking if something goes wrong, we're in big, big trouble. And I think for most decision makers on funds, that's where they stop. Whereas the thing to do is say, okay, let's do our due diligence to see if this thing is workable, can happen. So the concept, and they've had their first truck stop. It's been in place for well over 2 years, so there's data. The IRR on that particular investment are well above 25%. The point is that on the truck stop, they have multi-pump, what do you call them? Like they have engine, BP, total, because they understand that different truck companies have different loyalty programs, so they consolidate it all together. The big thing was to create space, safe space for drivers and their buses to come and park. So there are parking bays for trucks, and there's accommodation for truck drivers. There is primary healthcare facility, so there's a doctor on site and a nurse on site. And now they're going to be doing ARV distribution at these truck stops. People like Volvo and Mercedes are now on the truck stops, and they're fixing and maintaining trucks on this truck stop. There's accommodation, there's food. So it's an integrated one-stop, one-stop logistical hub for the trucking industry. The point is, it's making good money. It's taking care of members' needs. The insurance companies are coming on board, and the insurance premiums for those truck owners who use those trucks have come down. The returns are there because there are multiple sources of income that are coming in, from diesel to your office space from Volvo and so on and so forth. So what I'm saying is it's possible to do things that are different and still make returns for members. But you're saying, how did this fund get to this place? And I say partly it's because of their relationship with unlisted up to this point. Because if you think about a truck stop, it's how do you use property in a way that creates a truck stop. Before then, they'd had almost a 10-year history on doing unlisted property. So they had shopping centers in, these underprivileged areas. And in fact, not long ago, they were opening one in Philippines. And you see the impact of these sort of investments when you go there. There was an opening, and there was a riot when we went to do the opening of this
Housing estate?
retail, simply because people were saying, I can see that there are people who are getting jobs. Where is my job? So you see the real impact. Even in the truck stop, which is in Harrismith, the first one, it's now the second biggest employer in Harrismith. This fund is now seeding an affordable housing fund focused on RDP, low-income housing, and the intention is that they'll have a primary school, healthcare center. But I think that the importance is not only to have the right manager who understands the sort of investments that you want to manage, but also the sort of partnerships you need to make that a reality. So is government on board? Is a community on board? Who is on board that you need to be on board for that investment to be viable?
And just help with the trustee governance budget that allowed for this investment and the asset consulting input in terms of managing the risks, etc. What made it work for this fund?
Sure. What made it work was simply we had an asset manager who had managed the property division of this, property investments of this particular fund for a long time. So we understood that they knew what they were doing. But secondly, the due diligence and the numbers that came out. So there was a thorough due diligence process that was undertaken. Before they even put one investment in, they understood who the different people were going to come in. Like when you do any retail investments, you need to make sure that you've secured your tenancies before you do your actual investment. So all of those things were in place. We had the right asset manager, and the consultants had been doing unlisted for quite a long time. So those two components came together.
Maybe just throw some more radical ideas out there, and maybe Elias, you can say whether this is something that could be taken forward in a conversation. So as I said, one of the challenges is defined contribution, and also the fact that every time you move jobs, you move retirement funds. Even though preservation is being driven very hard, in concept you still have short-dated timeframes to be in a single fund. Obviously the FSB, now FSCA, has focused a lot on getting funds to go into umbrella funds. But still, you change your employer, you change umbrella funds. So it's not necessarily making you a more long-dated investor. And I sometimes look at different regimes across the world, and Australia always fascinates me, because there your DC fund is all that's there. There's very little DB, so similar to South Africa. But your investors have massive amounts in unlisted. So what's different? And the difference is industry funds. So similar to the bargaining council funds that we have here, that you actually join a fund for life, in which case you are a 45-year investor. You've got a clear opportunity to go into unlisted investments from a risk and return point of view. Hello, it works. So it's quite a conversation to think about to government, FSCA, etc., to say, if we were looking for a voluntary 5%, maybe we look at the umbrella funds. And it is going to be voluntary. I think we're all happy that prescription is the wrong thing to do. But also preservation funds, unclaimed benefit funds, these are all longer dated funds. Defined benefits funds will also tend to be. Is this maybe a conversation that could be had to talk about a better way to facilitate a voluntary 5%, getting it into development assets?
Yeah, there's no doubt. That's where we should start. But I think it also comes with some bit of education. And the education starts with the fundamental principle of putting money aside for retirement. You do that because you want to retire comfortably. But at the same time, you don't want to live like a king in retirement and live like a pauper in your productive years. So there is a balance that is required between these two periods. And the balance, I think, to an extent, is illustrated by the example that has been used here, where the way in which we invest, the way in which we access our assets, accumulated interest, in our productive years, is indicative of how the future is going to look like. If you don't match those and think about them as a wholesome decision, you're actually missing the point. Now, what we need to be doing is to give the contributor for retirement to realize that it is worthwhile to be involved in putting money aside for retirement. The way in which you make it worthwhile is making sure that they can actually benefit from the resources today. They don't have to wait until they get to the age of 55, 60 before they benefit. Now, investing in their areas is one way of accessing the accumulated interest. If you build hospitals, you build the truck stops, you build schools, you build post offices, all of a sudden, you are enhancing the quality of life of those people during their productive years. What gave me goosebumps was when I was still in the Jeep, sitting on the board of the GPF, after we'd done some of the rural investments that were done. And we invested in shopping malls. It was interesting that a significant number of GPF members started voting with their feet. They never went to a mall that is not owned by the GPF. They shop from what they called our own mall. And that sense of identity is a very important part of trying to show people that it is good to invest for retirement. So you are living as a king today as when you get to retire. Singapore saw this very, very well. They worked out that your replacement ratio is a function of three fundamental things: health, roof above your head, and food. And they said, you probably cannot invest in food now, but you can invest in the roof above your head now. You can build a house out of accessing your assets, where it is cheaper to build a house now than it will be when you have to build it in 30 years' time when you retire. So if you access your assets to construct a house, it is allowed. The same is allowed if you're going to buy post-retirement medical aid, because you've already secured or insured yourself against the biggest risk, two biggest risks when you get to retirement. The only thing that you have to worry about is where you're going to get a plate of food. And that is the way in which we need to start thinking about how we actually manage these resources, how we actually invest. So as a result, the idea for me of preservation is always circumstantial. You preserve to what end? If you don't have an end to why you preserve, it's very difficult to convince someone to preserve if they know that they are going to be worse off by preserving than if they do something else. So it's a debate that we still need to have, and we need to balance it out. It's not a black and white. But that discussion needs to take place.
Agreed, it's complex, and if we don't have the right conversations, then there's knee-jerk reactions, and we just don't get the right outcomes. So my next section was titled, If You Were in Government. So if the three of you can please apply your minds. So, anyone? No, not yet. So one of the challenges we've spoken about a lot today is we all know what needs to be done. We've got all the plans, we're talking about it, but it's not actually happening. So let's get some concrete examples of what you would do. And as I know you mentioned, looking at other countries, and Indonesia had got a way to be far more specific on what investments were required and getting people to invest into them, rather than this nebulous, we all need to invest into development. So what would you do today in order to get private sector, pension fund assets into the investments that you wanted to make an impact to this country in terms of growth and job creation? Isaah, let's start with you.
Perhaps the first thing is to recognize that it's not only government that is responsible for making the country work. And it's not only the responsibility of private sector that is going to make the country work. It's a bit of both. If you look in most businesses that start today, they are a sharing kind of business. Look at Uber, look at many other businesses. It's a shared economy. So the responsibility has to be shared by both public sector and private sector. What is the government's function? Is to provide that which the private sector cannot profitably. So lay out the regulatory framework, but also take some of the risks which the private sector, like pension funds, because of their fiduciary duty, cannot, and then de-risk those investments to make it easy for the private sector to participate and also take some of the risk. But it cannot be government alone that takes the risk. Neither can it the pension fund member or the private investor that takes the risk. So a collaborative effort is required. If you look at Indonesia, what they did essentially was to look at which are the sectors that has the biggest impact in terms of growth, in terms of employment, and they laid out those sectors, and then they came up with a tax incentive structure, which says if you are investing new money into this sector, the tax rate is going to be lower than what is currently applicable to the rest of the economy. And that naturally attracted a lot of money. They started this in 2014, trying to raise about $450 billion. We're only looking for 100 billion, which is just about a quarter of what they're looking for. But because of that tax incentive structure, they have managed to attract a lot of private sector money that created jobs. A similar thing can be done here. We can identify the sectors that are job intensive or labor intensive and try to incentivize or to make it easier for private capital to flow into those sectors without the need for prescription. That is one obvious way. But you may get a pushback that says, if we cut tax for these sectors, it means we are depriving government of tax revenue. But why does government require tax? They require tax to spend on the social services which the private sector cannot. But if the tax incentive creates jobs, it means you don't have to take care of those people using social grants. So the need for tax for government also declines naturally by providing incentive. But obviously, those tax incentives are not open-ended. You can structure something that says for the first 5 years or until you break even or until a particular point when you have reached this particular stage, then you normalize in terms of your tax to the rest of the economy. But you make sure that you allow the sectors that benefit society to grow before they are taxed at the same rate. That should be able to incentivize investment.
All right. Thank you, President Isaah. Mabatho, Elias, any thoughts if you were in government?
Listen, I think you've already said a lot, so I'm not going to go, and I agree with a lot of the things that you've said. The other thing that people say prevents them from investing in things that are in the real economy is projects. If our government had spent allocate a lot of money in creating projects that are investable, if the problem is projects, then spend the money creating the projects so that people can invest. That's what they say they're waiting for. They're not saying they don't want to do it. They're saying there are no projects. So resolve that. I think the other thing, and Elias touched on it, I guess, is the conversations with the private sector to say, okay, private sector, what would it take for you to invest in an Eskom? You know, what do we need to do? And be flexible enough to accommodate some of the requirements from the private sector, because then it's not prescription. It's a collaborative solution that brings an input from best practice from private sector and from government. I also think one of the other things that's not happening, and it frustrates me because I can see good in everywhere. There's grant funding that is within government control. There's private sector money, there's DFI money, but we're not talking to each other. It's such a fragmented approach. Somebody has to bring the stakeholders together to see how we can use blended financing to have financially engineered solutions that will unlock investments. In other words, can you use grant funding to reduce the risk of some of these projects so that you can attract private sector funding? There's a lot that can be done. The funding is there. I feel like people are talking in pockets. And then the last thing is making sure that the arms of governments all speak the same language. So in other words, if you say impact investing is important, the tax people must come to the party. The regulator who regulates pension funds must come to the party, because there's still some sort of challenges around how you're managing some of the unlisted investments with the regulator. You know what I mean? So all aspects of government,
barriers.
yes. So all aspects of government must be on the same page. There must be consistent understanding on how they support the process.
President Elias, anything to add?
I'll start off by saying, or repeating what I said earlier on. The problem is not money, the problem is not capital. The problem are the institutions that function and the incumbents who are running those institutions. And in particular, how we actually intermediate the capital that is out there. To deal with this, I would draw on the Chilean example, where we may not like him, but when Pinochet realized that the country was going to the dogs, he said, I have value, I see the value in retirement funding. I have to reform the pension industry so that it changes the future of the country. But what he also realized is you cannot reform the pension industry without reforming the financial sector. That meant a lot of changes took place in the financial sector. And he also concluded that I cannot change the financial sector if the macroeconomy is also not restructured. Labor laws were one of the major things that he had to deal with. Now, if you have to deal with all of those things at the same time, you need what is called a legitimate government. A leadership structure that everybody believes in it. In South Africa, I think we're struggling in many of those fronts. And that says to me, it's going to take a very long time for us to get to a point where we function like a well-oiled machine as a country. How do you do that? I think a mini Pinochet is something that you may be thinking about. A benevolent dictator. Somebody who says, this is where the country should be going. This is what I think we should be doing for the country, not for myself, and pushes those. We've had an example in South Africa, and it worked because we had a benevolent dictator. When we had to launch the World Cup, we had to put stadia in many parts of the country in a finite period of time with predetermined quality levels and predetermined budgets. Did we fail? No, we didn't. We're able to deliver on all that at record time. Simply because FIFA said to us, you shall. If you don't, you are not hosting the World Cup. We need a scenario like that in South Africa that says, you shall, because if you don't, the country is going to the dogs. And we need somebody to be able to have the boldness to do that. Whether that person is in government or is in the private sector, for me, it's immaterial. We just need to have the different attitude of leadership to take us away from the brink, because that's where we are now.
All right, thank you. A lot of good advice for President Ramaphosa there. We are running out of time, so let me just go through some of the questions, and I hope most of them have been answered. But one of them relates to what conversations has the industry had with government to create the platform for impact opportunities. Maybe, Elias, if you could talk to the SA Impact Investment Forum, because that was one of the key interactions before the broader investment conference last year.
Do you want me to tell you how badly it performs?
Well, if it's that bad, then maybe not. What conversations should we be having at the SA Impact Investment Forum? What are the challenges?
The Impact Investment Forum that is operating in South Africa today is actually a formation that originates from what is called the Global Steering Group on Impact Investing, which is a G8 origination. But the G8 quickly realized that, in fact, impact investing is less important to us than it is to the rest of the world, in particular the developing world. They then opened their doors to the participation of developing economies. As we speak now, I stand to be corrected on the numbers, we have close to $300 billion US, which is allocated towards impact investing in the north, where they don't really need it, and very little in the south, where we really need it. As we speak, the GSG is on a roadshow to raise $1 billion US for an education outcomes fund for Africa. All that money is going to be used on the continent. And all that they require is the private sector to raise their hands and commit to delivering on education at GSG funding at no cent to the investor. The only prerequisite is you go out, you invest in that educational institution, you show that you've had an impact in your society or in the environment in which you've invested in that entity. And if you can prove that you're ticking all boxes, all your initial capital plus interest gets paid back to you. Now, there's precedent to this. The GSG, together with the World Bank, have run similar pilots in 3 countries across the globe, and they've been very successful. But what it requires are people who are going to change their thinking, who have a new set of beliefs. And one of those beliefs is that people out there or society out there is not looking for charity. They are looking for opportunities. If you invest in the right places and you provide the opportunities, they will play. Secondly, the capitalism of today is not going to sustain us going forward. We now need a very different capitalism, where we argue that instead of an invisible hand, you need an invisible heart that is going to inform the hand what the right ideals are. That is the grouping of people who are behind impact investing globally. And they are not asking for grants from anyone. They are digging from their own pockets. It's all private sector capital, and it's yielding the same returns that you will get in traditional investments. And that's what Impact Investing South Africa is about, bringing the capital to South Africa and hope it works for the country.
Maybe, so we are running out of time, so I did say I wanted to bring climate change to some extent into the conversation. Maybe to continue with what you just said about what will it take to bring international investors to South Africa. And obviously for me, one of the first things is don't do prescription, because that creates policy uncertainty. But the concept of the just transition and the ability to say we need to transition from coal to green, but we need to create jobs, etc., that are going to be lost within the dirty industries. And the concept that international investors looking for carbon credits will, in the right circumstances, flood into the country to look for these types of investments. So maybe just a comment for any of you of what you believe are the imperatives to attract international investors to investments like those, and what are the definite don't-dos in terms of some of the mistakes that might have been made by other countries.
I have just one. Just be able to encourage the domestic investors to invest, international to come.
And policy certainty and no prescription, etc. Maybe I'll just add those for myself. And then maybe just to finish off, if I can just ask each of you to reflect on what you would like people to take away from today in terms of the trigger that's actually going to get us to where we want to be. Enough talk now. What's the trigger that's going to get some action? Elias, let's start off with you.
Madiba used to say it is in our hands. And I think here, it's in our intellect. I think we're smart enough to realize if we don't invest right, what we're trying to protect we will not have tomorrow. And we need to put alternatives on the table to what government has put and play the leaders. Impact investing is one of those alternatives. And if you can use it as your flagship and make it your Marshall Plan for South Africa, we'll go places.
Thank you.
Yeah. Just, I suppose my last point is this. Our investment strategies need to reflect our reality on the ground and the desires of our membership. Many of them are not going to be able to run away to Australia. They are here to stay. So this thing of investing offshore at the expense of South Africa has to stop. I think it's important that our investment strategy reflect the need of this country to invest in the real economy, in order to overcome some of the socioeconomic challenges that we are having and to meet the desires of our members. Also, it's time you told your service providers, demand, this is what we want to do. Come to the table with the solutions so that we can invest. It's no longer a negotiation. It's you telling them, this is what we want to do. So come to the party with the solutions. And the beauty is the solutions are there. I, on the other hand, I'm very optimistic. I think this is a timing, and I see a lot happening. So, yeah, impact investing is the right thing. Also from a managing of risk, that diversification and the yield pickup will help you anyway.
Great, thank you.
For me, I think it's one, you need to empower women the world over. In my experience working in the professional industry, I have benefited a lot from being led by women, being mentored by women. If you look at the JSE top 40, you ask yourself how many companies are run or are led by women, very few. You look at country leaderships, how many are women, very few. There was the same site at the World Economic Forum last week, very few women participation. Perhaps that's why we are in the mess that we are in as the world. A few
I think we can all agree with that, right?
Secondly, the way the investment professionals calculate return possibly needs to change. Is it possible to quantify the returns of a stable society, the returns of a better educated population that gets reflected in what you call return to investment? Because without a stable society, even the financial returns are not going to matter. As Mr. Elias said earlier on, ultimately, if we don't get a stable society, the burning buildings in Joburg CBD will come to Sandton. And the solution is not to stop the burning buildings coming to Sandton, is to stop all burning buildings. And that you need to do by investing in the things that make society a fairer world.
All right, thank you very much. If I can give my panel a round of applause. Thank you to all three of you. It's very easy to chair a panel when you have such competent speakers. So thank you for making it an interesting session. Thanks.